If she hasn't had the children herself, or Harry hadn't been involved, then they can't be in the royal line.
The morning started like any other. Cameras rolling, coffee cooling, hosts warming up for another routine segment. Nobody in that studio expected what was about to happen. Nobody in their living rooms did either. Then Angela Levin sat down, adjusted her microphone, looked directly into the camera, and everything changed. Because what came out of her mouth next wasn't just commentary. It wasn't just opinion. It was a series of pointed, calm, carefully laid out observations about Archie and Lilibet, Harry and Meghan's two children, that stopped the entire country cold. By the time she finished speaking, social media was already on fire. Clips were already flying. And Prince Harry? According to multiple sources close to the situation, Harry was anything but calm. So what exactly did Angela Levin say? Why is Harry's reaction becoming a story all on its own? And what does any of this mean for two little children growing up at the center of one of the most controversial families in modern history? Stay right here, because this story goes deeper than you think, and the further you go, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Who is Angela Levin, and why does she matter? Before we get into what she said, let's talk about who Angela Levin actually is, because that context matters enormously here. Angela Levin is not a tabloid gossip columnist. She is not someone who trades in rumor for clicks. She is one of the most respected and longest-serving royal correspondents in British media. She has spent decades covering the monarchy from the inside out, building relationships, earning access, and developing a reputation for saying the things that others in her field hesitate to touch. She had exclusive access to Prince Harry himself for her authorized biography on him. She spent time with him, traveled with him, and heard things from him directly that the wider public never got to hear. That matters. That matters a great deal, because when Angela Levin speaks about Harry and Meghan, she is not speculating from the outside. She is drawing from a depth of knowledge and royal understanding that very few people on this planet can match. And that is precisely why the room shifts when she speaks. That is why hosts lean forward. That is why viewers put down their phones and pay attention. It is not just what she says, it is the weight she carries when she says it. Her track record speaks for itself.
That America does not like to take people in who take drugs.
She called things about Harry and Meghan's trajectory long before they became headlines. She warned about tensions inside the palace. She pointed to the cracks before most people could even see them forming. And she was right, time after time. What makes Levin especially formidable in moments like this is that she has nothing to prove. She is not building a brand. She is not chasing subscribers. She does not need the attention. She has already written the book, literally, on Prince Harry. She has already established herself at the top of her profession. When someone at that level of credibility chooses to make a specific point on a live national broadcast, they have weighed it carefully, they know exactly what they are doing, and they have decided the moment is right. So when Angela Levin appeared on that morning program and began speaking in that calm, measured, unflinching way of hers, when she turned her attention specifically to Archie and Lilibet, the people who know her work felt it immediately. This wasn't casual. This wasn't filler. This was Angela Levin saying something she had clearly been building toward for a long time. The kind of thing you only say when you are certain, when the moment is right, and when you have decided that silence is no longer the responsible option. And the questions she raised? They are not going away. The broadcast that broke the internet. Let's set the scene properly, because the atmosphere in that studio matters. Angela Levin walked in looking completely composed, calm, almost serene. The kind of calm that comes not from having nothing to say, but from knowing exactly what you are about to say and being entirely prepared to say it. The hosts next to her, by contrast, could be seen shifting slightly in their seat as things progressed. Even the people paid to keep things comfortable on live television looked a little caught off guard. She didn't open with drama. She didn't wave her arms or raise her voice. She simply began laying out, piece by piece, the questions that have swirled around Archie and Lilibet's births. Questions about royal protocol, about transparency, about the way things have traditionally been handled for centuries in the British monarchy, versus how they were handled in this case. She pointed out that royal births historically follow a very specific and very public structure.
Certainly after the pandemic and everything else, we crave that. We crave being able to go high and
There are official statements released at precise moments. There are confirmations from named medical professionals. There are formal bulletins, sometimes famously, placed on a gilded easel outside Buckingham Palace, a tradition that stretches all the way back to 1837. There is a location, there is a time, there is a weight, there are signatures. Everything is documented with the kind of precision that reflects the constitutional importance of royal lineage. Births tied to the royal line of succession are not treated like ordinary private matters. They never have been. There are reasons for that. Legal, constitutional, historical reasons that go back generations. The verification of a royal birth is not about pageantry for its own sake. It is about public trust, institutional legitimacy, and the documented record that the monarchy depends on for its authority. These are not optional traditions. They are the architecture that gives the institution its meaning. So when Angela Levin began highlighting the ways in which the births of Archie and Lilibet appeared to depart from those established norms, the audience felt it. Because it wasn't a personal attack, it wasn't a rant, it was a structured, evidence-based comparison between what has always been done and what appeared to have been done in this case. And the differences she outlined were stark. No photos outside hospital doors, no detailed medical statements, no formal breakdown of the birth process from named professionals, no gilded easel, no structured public timeline. For Archie's birth specifically, the announcement arrived later than tradition would dictate, and multiple standard details were simply absent. The location itself was surrounded by conflicting reports, with no clear official confirmation ever coming to settle the matter. And then she asked the question that made the whole studio go quiet. Why? Why for a couple who spent years fighting publicly for recognition, fighting for their children's titles, fighting to be seen as legitimate members of the royal family? Why were the births handled in a way that raised more questions than it answered? It was a simple question, but it landed like a thunderclap. The details that don't add up. Now let's go through the specific details that Angela Levin highlighted, because this is where things get genuinely difficult to explain away. Start with Archie's birth announcement. When Prince George was born, when Princess Charlotte arrived, when Prince Louis came into the world, the public was informed in advance that the Duchess of Cambridge had been admitted. Updates came in real time. The birth announcement included a full breakdown: location, time, weight, the names of the medical team involved, and a formal confirmation signed by those professionals. It was structured, it was transparent, it was exactly what the tradition demands. With Archie, none of that happened in the same way. The public found out after the fact. The standard medical details were stripped back, the names of professionals were not disclosed in the same manner. And when the first photos of Archie were released, kept at a minimum, carefully selected, tightly controlled, royal watchers noticed immediately how different the presentation felt from what they had seen before. Now, some people, many people even, accepted Harry and Meghan's well-documented desire for privacy as the explanation. And that desire is understandable. They had made clear throughout Meghan's pregnancy that they were stepping back from the full public visibility that comes with senior royal status. That was their stated choice. That was their right. But here is the problem with that explanation.
because it feels really inclusive and there's representation and it's just like a sweet love story.
And Angela Levin put her finger on it precisely. You cannot, on one hand, invoke the trappings of royalty when it suits you. The titles, the institutional weight, the Netflix documentaries about palace life, the Oprah interviews where you claim your children were denied rights as members of the royal family, and then, on the other hand, refuse to follow the protocols and transparencies that make those claims verifiable. You cannot have it both ways. Either the births follow the royal protocols that give them their constitutional weight and verify their place in the line of succession, or they don't. And if they don't, then the very claims Harry and Meghan have made about their children's treatment become harder to assess. If you fight publicly for your son's title, but you don't provide the documentation that royal births traditionally require, you are creating a vacuum. And vacuums don't stay empty for long. People fill them. Angela Levin didn't accuse anyone of anything directly. She pointed to gaps. She pointed to inconsistencies. She asked questions that, in a situation where all the normal documentation had been provided, would simply not exist. And then she pointed to the timeline, which is where even more eyebrows started rising. When people began comparing the details that were publicly shared about the progression of Meghan's pregnancy with photographs and appearances, certain things didn't quite line up the way observers expected. Royal watchers, people who have studied these things closely for years, began noticing what they described as inconsistencies in how the pregnancy appeared to progress publicly. Again, no accusations, no proof of anything, just questions, just gaps where answers should exist, just the nagging sense that something about the official picture didn't quite fit together the way it should. And in the absence of clarification, official, detailed, documented clarification, those gaps only grow wider. The surrogacy conversation enters the mainstream. Here is where the story takes another turn, because Angela Levin's appearance didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at a moment when a conversation that had previously been confined to the fringes of the internet was beginning to break into the mainstream. The surrogacy theory, the suggestion that Meghan may not have carried Archie and Lilibet herself, had been circulating online for years. It had been dismissed, largely correctly, as a fringe conspiracy, the kind of thing you'd find in the comment sections of royal forums or on anonymous YouTube channels run by people with axes to grind. Most serious commentators refused to touch it. Most reputable outlets wouldn't go near it. But something shifted, partly because the questions about the birth details persisted, partly because the photographs that circulated online continued to generate debate, regardless of how many times people tried to shut the conversation down, and partly because the couple's own behavior, particularly in relation to the Oprah interview, where they claimed Archie had been denied a title because of his race, without ever providing evidence for that explosive claim, left a residue of distrust that made people less willing to simply accept the official narrative at face value. It is worth pausing on that last point, because it is critically important to understanding how we got here. Trust, once broken, is very hard to rebuild, and Harry and Meghan broke it. Not once, but repeatedly. Every unverified claim, every allegation that was later walked back or quietly contradicted, every dramatic assertion that turned out to be more complicated than it had been presented. Each one chipped away at the credibility that would have made people willing to give them the benefit of the doubt in moments exactly like this one. When Angela Levin raised these same questions in a mainstream broadcast setting, it changed the nature of the conversation entirely. It wasn't anonymous anymore. It wasn't fringe. It was one of Britain's most respected royal journalists, sitting on a national television program, asking the same questions that millions of people had been asking online, but doing it with the authority and credibility that comes from decades of legitimate journalism. That is a massive shift. That is the moment something crosses a threshold. Once a credible, named senior journalist raises a question on a national platform, the story is no longer containable. It becomes part of the official record of the conversation. It gets cited, it gets built upon. Other journalists feel permission to ask the same questions. The window of what is acceptable to explore publicly has been permanently widened, and Harry's camp, by all accounts, noticed it immediately. Harry's reaction, and why it made everything worse. So how did Harry respond? This is the part of the story that people could not stop talking about, because the response, by all accounts, made everything significantly worse. Sources close to the situation described Harry as under serious pressure almost immediately after Levin's broadcast began making the rounds. And rather than taking the approach that PR professionals universally advise in situations like this, stay calm, prepare a clear and factual response, address the questions directly and move on, the response that emerged appeared to be reactive, urgent, and emotionally charged. Reports described phones ringing off the hook, urgent meetings being convened, a frantic atmosphere as people around Harry tried to manage the speed with which the story was spreading. The word used by multiple sources was tense. Harry was tense. The situation felt tense. And that tension was leaking out in ways that were very visible to the outside world. Now ask yourself this: if the answers to Angela Levin's questions are simple, if the explanation is straightforward, if the documentation exists and can be produced, if the timeline holds up under scrutiny, then why does any of this require urgency? Why does a calm, factual question from a journalist produce a reaction that sources describe as frantic? That contrast became impossible to ignore, and social media made absolutely sure of it. On one side of every screen, there was Angela Levin, poised, steady, methodical, repeating her points in the same measured tone, regardless of what reaction they generated. On the other side, there were reports of Harry in a state of visible agitation, trying to manage a situation that kept growing faster than any response could contain it. Calm versus reaction. Composed versus overwhelmed. The contrast was so stark, that it became the story. The question stopped being just about what Angela Levin said. The question became, why is Harry reacting like this? There is a basic principle in crisis communications that every publicist, every legal advisor, every media strategist knows by heart. The cover-up is always worse than the crime. The reaction always tells more of the story than the original event. And when you react to a question with panic rather than clarity, you are essentially telling the world that the question has touched something real. And Meghan? Meghan was nowhere. Not a statement, not an appearance, not a single public word. For a couple who have built an entire brand around speaking out, around being vocal, around confronting narratives they disagree with directly and loudly, the silence from Meghan was deafening. And people noticed Meghan's silence and what it means. Within hours of the story gaining full momentum, "Where's Meghan?" was trending. Not as a joke, not as a meme, as a genuine question being asked by millions of people across social media platforms simultaneously, because this was a moment that directly concerned her. These were questions about her children's births, her pregnancies, her body, her choices, and she was absolutely nowhere to be seen. Harry and Meghan have always operated as a unit, at least publicly. Every major statement, every interview, every Netflix documentary, every public appearance has been carefully coordinated between the two of them. Their brand is built on the idea of solidarity, of two people against the world, standing shoulder to shoulder, always aligned, always together. But this time, Harry appeared to be completely alone in handling the pressure, and Meghan appeared to have stepped entirely off the stage. Royal commentators were quick to jump on the significance of that dynamic. Some argued her silence was strategic, that she calculated staying quiet would minimize her exposure and let the story burn itself out faster. That interpretation is certainly plausible. Meghan is not someone who acts without calculation. But others saw it very differently. To those observers, the silence read not as strategy, but as distance, as if Harry was being left to absorb the full force of this story on his own, while the person who arguably had the most direct stake in answering the questions being raised remained invisible. That is a striking image. A prince, globally recognizable, reportedly under enormous pressure, managing a media storm that won't stop growing, and his wife, nowhere to be found. Was it strategy? Was it something else? Was there a disagreement behind the scenes about how to respond? Nobody outside their immediate circle knows for certain, but that uncertainty, that lack of the united front the public has come to expect, fed the speculation machine even further. And this is the thing about silence. It is never truly silent. In the absence of words, people write their own stories. And the stories people wrote about Meghan's absence were not flattering. Consider the precedent that had been set. When the Oprah interview aired, one of the most explosive royal interviews in modern history, Meghan was front and center. She was composed, articulate, and clearly in command of the narrative. She spoke about her mental health. She spoke about her children. She spoke about race and palace intrigue and the loneliness of institutional life. She did not shy away. She leaned in. That Meghan, the one who stepped into the global spotlight to share some of the most intimate and damaging claims about the royal family ever made publicly, was nowhere to be found when it was her children's births, her pregnancies, her own body being discussed. The contrast is not subtle, and it is not something people were willing to simply ignore. If you are willing to talk when the narrative benefits you, but you disappear when questions are being asked, that pattern does not go unnoticed. It gets remembered, and it gets used against you in exactly the moments when your credibility matters most. The children at the center. In all of this, all the media noise, all the speculation, all the back and forth about protocols and timelines and titles, it is easy to lose sight of what sits at the center of this story. Two children, Archie, Lilibet. Real children who did not ask to be born into this situation, did not ask to be used as subjects of controversy, and did not ask to spend their childhoods being discussed and debated by millions of strangers around the world. Angela Levin made this point with particular force, and it is the point that, more than any other, deserves to land. These children are being raised in what she described as a kind of show, not a life, a performance. They are paraded selectively, shown when showing them serves a purpose, hidden when hiding them serves a purpose. Their images are controlled with extraordinary precision. Their existence is invoked strategically whenever Harry or Meghan need public sympathy or narrative leverage, but the details that would ground their existence in verifiable reality are withheld. Think about what that means for those children as they grow up. Think about the world they are inheriting, where their births are debated online, where their legitimacy is questioned in mainstream media, where they are simultaneously protected and weaponized by the two people who are supposed to simply be their parents. Think about when Archie is old enough to search his own name. Think about what he will find. Think about the conversations he will have to have with schoolmates, with friends, with anyone who has access to the internet and knows who he is. The controversy being generated now does not disappear when these children grow up. It becomes the permanent digital backdrop to their lives. Every headline, every debate, every unanswered question will still be there, waiting. Angela Levin drew a comparison that struck many people as devastatingly apt. She invoked Michael Jackson, who famously dangled one of his children from a balcony and covered their faces with masks when taking them out in public. The parallel is uncomfortable, but the underlying pattern it identifies, children being used as both prop and secret, simultaneously visible and concealed, is difficult to dismiss. These are children who deserve clarity. They deserve a stable, documented, uncontroversial identity. They deserve parents whose public behavior does not make their very existence a matter of global debate. And right now, they are not getting any of that. The title question. There is one more layer to this story that Angela Levin addressed directly, and it is the layer that exposes the deepest contradiction at the heart of Harry and Meghan's entire public project: the titles. Archie and Lilibet are prince and princess by right of their birth, following King Charles's decision to extend the titles. Harry and Meghan have kept those titles, at least for now, and yet they are also the same couple who spent years publicly insisting they wanted a private life, free from the constraints of the institution. They left, they stepped back, they moved to California. They said they wanted normalcy for their children. So why hold on to the titles? If you want your children to have a normal life, if you plan to raise them in Montecito, send them to private American schools, build an identity for them as private individuals, then the titles do nothing useful. They create security risks. They make the children targets for bullying. They attach the children permanently to an institution their parents claim to despise. Angela Levin posed this question bluntly. What exactly are the titles for? If Meghan has political ambitions in America, and those ambitions have been widely reported, discussed, and speculated about for years, she cannot pursue them with those titles attached. If Harry is intent on a private life, the titles are a liability. The only explanation that makes coherent sense is that the titles are being kept as leverage, as insurance, as something to be bargained with, threatened with, or weaponized in future conflicts with the palace. They are a card that remains unplayed, but a card Harry and Meghan refuse to put down. And that calculation, if accurate, is one of the coldest things you can do to your own children. To attach them to a controversy, to a feud, to a political strategy, not for their benefit, but for your own. Prince William is apparently very aware of exactly this dynamic. Sources close to the future king have indicated that William has watched the situation unfold with considerable frustration, and that he is determined not to allow the institution to be held hostage by a couple who left it, but won't stop using it. The relationship between the two brothers, already strained beyond what most families could survive, has not been improved by any of this, and William, by all accounts, is paying very close attention to every move Harry and Meghan make with those titles. Exactly how that plays out in practice, only time will tell, but the battle over those titles, over what they mean, who they serve, and how long they last, is far from over. The media storm goes global. By the time this story had been circulating for 48 hours, it had gone far beyond the British royal press. It had gone global. American morning shows, the ones that typically treat royal coverage as light entertainment, a bit of sparkle to balance the hard news, dedicated full segments to it. Hosts who usually barely know the difference between a duke and an earl were suddenly breaking down royal birth protocols in careful detail, asking the same questions Angela Levin had raised, trying to understand why the story had the grip it did. British tabloids needed no encouragement. The front pages were relentless. New angles emerged daily. Comment pieces multiplied. Every reported detail about Harry's state of mind, every read of Meghan's silence, every recap of the original broadcast became its own story that fed a dozen more. Late-night television in America joined the conversation, not always charitably. Comedians built entire monologues around the contrast between Angela Levin's unshakable calm and Harry's reported agitation. The image of a composed British journalist and a frantic prince became a comedy staple almost overnight. That is not the kind of coverage you recover from easily. Online, the story became a content ecosystem unto itself. Reaction videos, timeline analyses, clip compilations, debate threads. Creators who had never covered royals before were suddenly producing hour-long breakdowns that pulled in hundreds of thousands of views. New audiences who had never followed this story were suddenly invested in it. And every time a new angle emerged, every time Harry's reported reaction generated another headline, the algorithm fed it to more people, and the cycle started again. There is a specific quality to this kind of story that makes it almost impossible to contain once it reaches a certain scale. It is not just one narrative. It is a dozen interconnected narratives, each feeding the others. The birth details question feeds the trust question. The trust question feeds the title question. The title question feeds the William and Harry relationship question. And beneath all of it, always, are two children whose faces keep appearing in every frame of the discussion, silent and unknowing. What Angela Levin started in one television segment had become something that no PR team, no legal threat, no amount of strategic silence could contain. What happens next? So where does this all go from here? That is the question everyone is asking, and the honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. But there are a few things that seem increasingly clear. First, the questions Angela Levin raised are not going away. They have now been asked publicly by a credible mainstream journalist on a national television platform, and they have received no substantive answer. In the absence of that answer, the questions will continue to circulate. They will continue to generate content, debate, and speculation. That is simply how the media ecosystem works in 2025. You cannot put that back in the bottle. Second, Harry's reported reaction has damaged him in a way that a composed, factual response might have avoided. When someone raises questions and you respond with visible agitation and urgency rather than calm clarification, you invite the interpretation that there is something to be agitated about. Whether that interpretation is fair or not, it is the one that people default to. Perception is reality in the court of public opinion. Third, Meghan's silence, however strategically calculated it may have been, has opened a crack in the united front that has always been central to their public image. And once people have seen that crack, they do not unsee it. The questions about what their relationship actually looks like behind the carefully managed public surface will only intensify. And fourth, and most importantly, the children at the heart of this story deserve better than what they are currently getting. Whatever the truth about the circumstances of their births, whatever the real motivation behind the title decisions, whatever is actually happening inside that Montecito household, Archie and Lilibet deserve to grow up in clarity, not controversy. They deserve parents who protect them genuinely rather than using them instrumentally. They deserve a future that isn't defined by their parents' battles. That is the quiet tragedy underneath all the noise. Two small children who had no say in any of this, and who are going to have to live with all of it. The really uncomfortable truth, the truth that nobody in this story seems to want to say plainly, is that the only people who can end this are Harry and Meghan themselves. They can answer the questions. They can provide the documentation. They can step back from the public stage entirely and give their children the genuinely private life they have claimed to want. They have more power over this narrative than anyone else. They always have. The choice to keep the controversy alive, to keep the titles, to keep invoking the institution while simultaneously attacking it, that is a choice. And every choice has consequences. Angela Levin sat down on that morning show and asked some questions. Simple questions, calm questions. Questions that had been floating around for years but had never been given a platform this visible, a journalist this credible, or a moment this perfectly timed. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She didn't need to. She simply laid out what was publicly known, identified what appeared to be missing, posed the questions that demanded answers, and let the audience draw their own conclusions from what they saw and heard. And the reaction that followed, Harry's reported agitation, Meghan's conspicuous silence, the global media storm, the trending hashtags, the late-night jokes, the millions of views, all of that tells you something. Because if the answers were simple, the reaction would not need to be complicated. The most revealing thing about this entire episode is not what Angela Levin said. It is what happened after she said it, the way the temperature changed, the way the room shifted, the way a calm, measured set of journalistic questions produced a response that looked, from the outside, like something very close to panic. Questions do not do that on their own. Only questions that have hit something real produce that kind of reaction. There is also something deeply important in the fact that it was Angela Levin specifically who put this on record, not an anonymous blogger, not a hostile tabloid editor, someone who knew Harry personally, someone who spent significant time with him, who understood how he thought and what he valued. When a person who was once trusted to tell your story turns around and asks the hard questions in public, it carries a very different weight than criticism from strangers. It closes off the easy defense of dismissing it as an attack from people who never knew you. It forces the question to stand entirely on its own merits. What do you think is really going on here? Do you believe Harry and Meghan have answers to these questions that they have simply chosen not to share? Or do you think the silence itself is the answer? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. Tell us what you think. Tell us what you see. This story has you asking the same questions Angela Levin is asking. Hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for every update as this story continues to unfold. Because one thing is absolutely certain, and it has been certain from the moment Angela Levin first opened her mouth: this is not over, not by a long shot.